Okay, it's been a couple of weeks. We've had a couple new banners for new units. We've had a couple reruns. I won't talk about reruns too much, but there are at least 2 new PvP costumes, or at least ones that are somewhat relevant for PvP I want to talk about. I'm not going to talk about Michaela. Michaela is kind of a niche magic unit, but we did get Beach Eclipse and base Levia coming out recently, so their banners haven't quite finished. So in case you're still thinking about whether you should pull for them, I want to talk about some of their pros and cons. In general, for PvE, I'll talk about that briefly, but for PvP, I'll talk about in a little more detail. So starting off with Beach Eclipse, before we can talk about, is she going to change the meta in PvP, the first thing you need to know is Eclipse is already S tier PvP unit with her bunny costume. Like, that costume does so much for you. Beach Eclipse is not going to change a ton, even if she's an absolute dud of a costume. So Eclipse is, one of the things it does do though is Eclipse is one of several units that cannot fully rotate. I've talked about in previous videos. So now she can rotate a little bit longer before running out of a costume. I do think that you should still prioritize her other costumes because of the SP suck, which her beach costume does not have. It's a little more PvE oriented. So you'd still probably run something like bunny base, beach, bunny base, and then you cry, or you can put a base in front if you want to open with base. But in general, I also think the 3v3 or 3x3 is not as strong as the big plus sign that her bunny and base Levia have in terms of their AoE, so especially on skip units. But the question is, when would we ever use this costume as like an opener? And the answer is probably no. It doesn't give her any new tools to deal with something like Idle Gran, and on defense, it's not something that's better innately than her 3-hit with the shred and the SP suck on her big plus sign. So I would still say bunny is better in just about every aspect. It does make her better, by definition, by turn 7 or 9 or wherever, when she runs out of rotations and she's able to use not only this costume, but she can follow up with base afterwards. It does fill a nice little hole there, but that's about it. So to answer the question, is Eclipse stronger? Sure. Should you use her beach costume first? Probably not. And I would queue it last just as a filler costume, but it's still nice to have. That being said, there's a lot of competition for good costumes. If you pulled for Therese, which is incredible, Morpia, which gave you new mechanics, Levia, I'll talk about briefly, is an absolutely awesome S tier costume. So I would say in general, Beach Eclipse is probably lower priority unless you already have her highly invested. If you think she's bae, whatever reasons people have to justify pulling, use that, but don't use like, oh, she's going to be better in PvP because of this. She might be a little bit, but not too much. And then talking about Levia, so base Levia came out, and this is an absolute killer costume. Just as a general note, if you're a newer player and you're struggling in the last night game mode, I highly recommend pulling for Levia +4 and then getting powder for her for +5 afterward, because she is the best unit in last night. She will help you push that 52 million for ACs, and she will help you put that 110 million for whatever that awakening material is called. So PvE aside though, Levia, I think, has right now a very niche use as a defense counter costume. So the first thing is that the problem, if you look at like what are the most common units on attack, you'll see PB Justia, you'll see Vanaka, and you'll see Amrubia a little bit further down. This is one of the most common attack comps used in top 100 PvP because it's so reliable. There are so few units, especially with limited SP on turn 2 and one of your units dead, it's very difficult to deal with a unit like Justia, who now has a 4-time evasion and has a giant Red Riding Hood shield, and she buffed herself up to absolutely demolish you turn 3. So there are very few costumes that can deal with that effectively. That's why Zenith has kind of gone into the meta a little bit on defense, just to give you some multi-hits to hope you have that, some kind of chance to delete these units. And in comes Levia, and Levia offers a new strategy, because whereas a unit like Morpia recently was released and said, hey, we're going to avoid evasion and just kill them through the Red Riding Hood shield, Levia tries to brute force instead and says, you need 4 hits, I'll give you 4 hits. And so she has her giant plus sign that hits 4 times and does a nuke in the middle. And so she's kind of a utility unit that will be followed up with some kind of solid DPS. And prior to the release, or prior to people realizing how strong Red Riding Hood was with the evasion costumes, Shira was a very strong counter to Red Riding Hood. Red Riding Hood wasn't considered as good because you could just dispel it. So Levia kind of helps you get back to that balanced state where Levia can get rid of the hits for PP Justia and or Maid Rubia, and then Stera can come in her first hit will, remove the costume, and then with the remaining hits of her multi-hit costume, she just wipes the floor with them. So I think a very strong combo for Levia right now would be base Helena for the buff, and then base Levia for the nuke and the multi-hit, and then having a Shara costume follow up for that DPS to clean up, 1 or 2 units on turn 2, and hopefully get rid of Red Riding Hood's shield as much as possible. And so that's what I think is kind of the base. And because of that, in general for team comps, I think Idle Gran is probably your best preemptive if you do run one, because one Idle Gran, Void Gran will benefit from Helena if she does survive till turn 2, but more importantly, she helps make sure that your 3 core units, be Helena, Shara, and Levia, all survive till turn 2. As far as the alternatives go, Void Gran's whatever. Void Gran's kind of a toss-up, but I really don't think Morpia works well with her. As I mentioned, they're kind of trying to attack the evasion problem with different approaches, right? One is trying to kind of get around the shield or around the evasion and just hit the shield, and the other one's trying to remove the evasion and then work its way through the shield with someone like Shara. But that being said, Levia not only has some utility as the multi-hit unit, but she also does an incredible amount of damage in that center spot. And so I run some numbers here that I think you should be running the elemental advantage with her in PvP so that she can specifically counter a ton of units. Wind units are incredibly common, as you'll see here. Again, Vanaka is an incredibly common DPS unit, and you kind of got to imagine these all with either the B Helena shield, which can be 55 to 60k depending on how strong it is, and the Red Riding Hood shield, which can be 30k at its most. I think Therese can work in some instances, but B Helena is more consistent and she's cheaper at 1 SP. But Levia can kill just about any wind unit, Diana, Vanaka, Zenith, through whatever shield you throw at them, the strongest Diana shield you could ever see. Here's some numbers here. She's going to be absolutely demolishing them, and all she needs is that B Helena buff. She doesn't need a Zenith or anything. And so not only, again, is she removing stacks on units like Emrubia and Justia, but she also is very likely to kill a unit, especially if it's wind, through even the strongest of Diana shields. So when comparing to alternatives, the obvious alternative to running base Levia would be running something like, Bunny Eclipse on defense, which is already S tier. So why would you run base Levia? And the reason is you want to specifically counter the evasion comp and do pretty well against the turtle comp. But the evasion comp in particular, because that's probably Eclipse's weakest point, is that she wants to have the SP suck and she wants to have the MRes shred, but none of that matters if she can't get through the number of hits for the evasion that are required for PB Justia and for Emrubia. And so Eclipse will oftentimes find that she doesn't get any value from her ability because she didn't even get the SP reduction because she never actually hit them. Levia gets around this because she's not looking for that. She's looking instead to just hit them a bunch of times and follow up with Shara while nuking a unit in the center. And so they're kind of solving different problems. And similarly, Eclipse generally won't have enough damage to actually kill through a Diana shield, but as I mentioned, with just a B Helena buff, Levia can kill a unit in the center if it's a wind unit through a Diana shield. And if it's not a wind unit, she can kill them through Red Riding Hood Rue in some cases, and of course if they have 0 MRes, then she can kill them just as Eclipse would in most cases. And lastly, of course, Levia just really does well into Vanaka, and Vanaka is a very, very common unit on attack. The stats here are a little misleading. They'll show Vanaka and PB Justia as neck and neck, and you think, oh, they're used, similarly, like 7.4%, 6.2% or whatever. It's actually a little more complicated than that because Vanaka is very commonly used as a turn 1 basic attack, and then she casts her costume on turn 3, and that would still show up here because of the way they show these stats. This isn't turn 1, this is the first costume in order, and so if DJ Vanaka lives to turn 3 and casts her costume, it gets thrown into these stats here, whereas Justia doesn't have something similar. She always opens PB Justia. In this case, she's never used as a basic attack. That's a bad idea. And so looking at these, I'd say Justia is a little more popular, but DJ Vanaka is still up there with Shahara and Justia as very, very popular DPSs, and she does well into those. So as far as tier list changes go, I don't have a ton of changes here. I'm keeping it pretty simple. I'm leaving up base Helena because I've seen more and more team comps are getting a little bit crazy with their offenses where they run base Helena, they run a strong Diana shield, and then they run a PB Justia, and they just have absolute tank. Like they're able to cover so many different bases at this point with turtle comps, and that's again where I think Levia can do really well into. Base Helena I've seen more. I didn't mention this last time, but with the release of the Engravings and Awakenings, there's now a threshold cross where base Eclipse can kill any idle Gran in the game, and so this unit I think can do really well on turn 1. And then I also moved down Alec. I think Alec has really struggled a lot in this meta with the release of Morpia in particular, what kind of sealed his fate. He was very much like an alternative to Justia, but never somebody that was better. There were very few situations where he did something better than Justia, and this is true even more now that Morpia is released. If you can imagine like a 2v2 or a 3v3 where Alec is alive and the enemy Morpia is alive, he's never going to be able to kill more than one of her spawns, and so she's going to overwhelm him over time with her repeated spawn count. And so Alec really struggles with his AoE, that he can't deal with that, and he has, you know, elemental disadvantage, so that's just one more kind of nail in the coffin for him. I wouldn't run him at all anymore. He just has too many weaknesses. He can do okay, but I think Justia just offers more with her PP Justia costume, with her BGJ that has, you know, the 350 AoE. She just in general offers more. There might be a time in the future where there's some more wind tanks that come out that are super popular, that Alec comes back and has his time to shine, but for now I would take him out of your comp if you're running them. But if you look at the stats, nobody's running him. And then I moved a couple of the other units. I did put, you know, base Levia and Eclipse. If you're a newer player and you're like, what do I even run on offense? You can run them, it's not horrible. They're going to struggle with idle Gran, but who doesn't? Then on turn 2, I actually didn't make any changes to any unit that was already here, but I did ask base Levia in the S tier. I put her at the bottom because I do want to clarify that she is meant to counter specifically the evasion comp. So if you find you're getting attacked by a lot of evasion comps, again, just run as I said, you know, idle Gran, be Helena, Levia and Shara, and then have one other flex comp, and just, you know, imagine Zenith is attacking me, Vanaka basic attack, made Rubia, how do I survive that on turn 1? You know, probably do fine after that. And then I did add also Eclipse, her Beach Eclipse costume. Again, I don't think it's great to do on turn 2, but if you're a new player and that's your only DPS and you want an investor, go for it, and, you know, save up for the Bunny Eclipse rerun that'll probably happen in December of this year, or maybe January next year. And then as I did mention, Alec, I moved down in the offense. I didn't touch him here because Alex still can do a ton of work, but I think he's forced to be paired with Therese for that bonus, you know, 3 times damage, where he can actually kill units that have big shields. Otherwise, I think this guy just really is very much ready to be thrown into the garbage. He just can't deal with other units. And so with that, I wanted to keep this video a little, you know, nice, short and sweet, give my thoughts on these 2 units. They do have like 4 days left in their banner or whatever, so if you're thinking about pulling a couple more copies of them, you know, it's up to you. But just remember, we are getting base Nebris next week, which should be hopefully saving her. And then we also have collab coming up in October as well. So always things to, you know, it's at the end of the day, it's your decision on what you want to pull on. But here are my thoughts on PvP. So with that, I'll catch you later in Mirror Wars, and good luck in your games.